Now, when we encounter an absolute value equation, it may not already be in the form the absolute value of some expression equals some number. So in that case, if we're given an absolute value equation that is not in that form, our first task should be to get that form. So let me show you an example. Let's suppose we're given the equation -3 times the absolute value x plus 5 plus 4 equals -2. Note that we cannot look at this and say, oh, I have equals -2. This must have no solution. We can't know that yet. We can't make that decision until our equation is in the form something with an absolute value equals a number. So what do? We treat this absolute value part as a block, and we isolate it. This will be a very common first step in complicated equations. Find the worst thing and isolate it. In this case, our worst thing is the absolute value. So we act as if this thing were our variable, and we solve for it. What's keeping this from being alone? Well, there's this plus 4. We'll subtract that on both sides. And we'll get -3 times the absolute value of x plus 5 equals -6. Now what do we need to do? We need to get rid of that -3. So we'll divide both sides by -3. And now we're left with the absolute value of x plus 5 by itself. And it's going to be equal to +2, right? -6 divided by -3 is +2. Now we're in this form, absolute value equals number. And we see that in fact it's the form absolute value equals positive number, which means we're going to have how many solutions? Right, 2 solutions. What will they be? They'll be where x plus 5 equals +2, or x plus 5, what's the other number x plus 5 might be? Right, -2. All right, now we solve for x, subtract 5 from both sides, and I get x equals -3 here. Subtract 5 from both sides, I get x equals -7 here. All right, let's confirm that these are really solutions to this original equation. All right, if I plug in x equals -3, I have -3 times the absolute value, -3 plus 5 plus 4, and I want to see, does it equal -2? -3 plus 5, that's 2. Absolute value of 2 is 2. -3 times 2 is -6. -6 plus 4 is in fact -2. Now I'll check my other solution. -3 times the absolute value of -7 plus 5 plus 4. I want to see, does it equal -2? Well, let's see. That'll be -3 times the absolute value of -2 plus 4, which is -3 times absolute value of -2, also 2. -3 times 2, that's -6. And -6 plus 4, still -2. All right. So these solutions really do work. What's the procedure for solving an absolute value equation? To solve an absolute value equation, first, we isolate the absolute value. That means we need to get the form, the absolute value of some expression equals a number. We need to get rid of anything this absolute value might be multiplied by, or anything that might be added to it or subtracted from it. Once we isolate the absolute value, then in the typical case we'll rewrite as two equations that don't have absolute value in either one. We're in the typical case as long as this number is positive. If this number is 0, we only get one equation without the absolute value in it. If this number is negative, there is no solution. We don't get any equations. We're done. But in the typical case, our equations will be whatever's inside the absolute value either equals our number, or whatever expression is inside the absolute value is the opposite of our number. And then the last step, now these are two linear equations. The last step will be to solve these two equations just as usual. Now this procedure, isolate the weird thing, somehow rewrite to get rid of the weird thing, and then solve equations without the weird thing, is going to be a very common procedure that we're going to meet over and over again. So for the moment, this only applies to absolute values, but it will apply elsewhere in the future. I'm going to give you an example to work following this procedure. Solve 5 times the absolute value x minus 3 plus 4 equals 29. Pause the video and try this now. Okay, our first step is to isolate the absolute value. We need to get the absolute value part by itself. Here's the absolute value part. We need to get it by itself. First we get rid of the 4. So we'll have 5 times the absolute value x minus 3 equals 25. And then we'll divide both sides by 5 to get the absolute value of x minus 3 is 5. Right, now notice we have the form an absolute value equals a number. And this is a positive number, so we're in the normal case. We can rewrite this as two separate equations. Either x minus 3 is 5, or x minus 3 is negative 5. And now we can solve these two equations. Add 3 on both sides. We'll get x equals 8, or x equals negative 2. So our solutions are x equals 8 or x equals negative 2.